So welcome to folks who are joining via the recording. So we have two topics today, one modeling and one about the API. The modeling issue that we'll get to first is about the measurement activity and how it relates to dimensions of objects. And then for the API discussion, we'll be talking in more detail about how we partition up the graph into responses. So and let me share my screen so that people aren't looking at just a incredibly boring black space. So the modeling issue then is around this dimension long cut versus has dimension shortcut. So the issue is that we have a principle of doing things only one way. So if there are two possible ways to do something, we should pick one so that we can be consistent. So that then would mean that if there is a choice between doing something as a linguistic object or as a note property directly on the object, then if there's a reason to use linguistic objects, then we would always use linguistic objects, even if it's slightly longer than just a simple string attached to the resource. So using this rationale, it would suggest that if we ever needed to know when a dimension was measured or who measured it or where that activity took place, then we would always want to use the measuring activity to create the dimensions, as opposed to the current pattern where we just have a has dimension property which goes from the object directly to the dimension. So the do things only one way and the longer way, if you ever need to use the longer way, would suggest that we always use the measuring activity. So do we need to do that? Well, what came up at the face-to-face meeting in Oxford was from a conservation standpoint, we do need to do that because we want to know which conservator did the measurement, if that was a simple height or width, or whether it was something more complicated. But from a collection management system perspective, from just the museum catalogue view, we almost never have the data for that. It's just recorded as the height of the painting is 36 inches. So we have conflicting use cases and audiences and whether the data is available or not for both of them, and hence we need to discuss which of our principles should take precedence. Do we always use a measurement, even though we would require the creation of nodes for no real value from the collection management standpoint? Or do we have two ways to do it? So use the shortcut for the collection management and also have measurement activities for the conservation use case. So that is the issue. It is issue 270 in GitHub. Are there any thoughts about this particular one? Is the issue clear enough, or would it benefit from some additional description?
How do you view this from a data consumer perspective? Do they benefit from this extra detail from conservation data?
I missed the first part of what you said, Chris.
So from a data consumer perspective, so the one that will be using the information, they miss this more detailed information regarding the conservation data?
Yeah. So some of the consumption patterns for it would be, well, to use an example from the Rijksmuseum, when the night watch was trimmed down to fit into City Hall. Before that, we would have a different measurement from what we do today. So even outside of conservation in terms of modern activities, having a measurement that occurred before, whenever in 1700 it was that it was moved, that gave the larger height and width, would then position that dimension in time relative to the current dimensions that that you doubtless have in your collection management system. So then a consumer of the information would be able to say the current dimensions are this, but it was previously measured at such and such a date to be this bigger set of measurements. Or for a more conservation science-centric use case, if you wanted to know who measured the weight of the statue and using which particular process or which set of scales or where it was done, I guess, would infinitesimally change the absolute value because gravity is different at different parts of the Earth. Would then, if you were wanting to construct a case around, this statue was hollowed out and then filled with modern plaster, whereas previously it was all marble, would be very beneficial compared to just knowing that at some point it had been weighed at some value. Any?
This really, I mean, I appreciate that there's a technical point that needs to be decided here, but this really seems to me about how we value two different communities. Immediately, anyway. In the future, it's a different question, but we're making things easier for some people and harder for other folks.
Yep.
This is something that can be part of some sort of application profile for linked conservation data, having the extended path and having the shorter path for the sort of CMS data.
Yeah, I think that would be my preference here, that we should value our communities more than we value strict adherence to design principles. And this one seems like a pretty clear one where two communities would always come to different answers, and hence we have to have both of them. We can't, if we were to pick one or the other, we would be, to Adam's point, we would be selecting one of the communities, both of whom are pretty good, solid stakeholders in the work, to take precedence. Because the collection management system folks will be like, why are we doing this thing that no one has data for? If we don't do that, then the conservation folks will say, well, this is our core business. We absolutely need this, so we can't do it. Or we can't. It would be a very reasonable explanation for why they would go off and do their own thing. So to me, this seems like a situation where we need to be flexible with our principles to ensure that everyone is feels like their requirements are being dealt with, and hence we should allow both, even if that means that consuming implementations would need to check for both patterns to know which one, or to find all of the data. Toby, I see that you've put some questions into chat.
Yeah, I thought that maybe I would just actually just say them out loud. But what I was thinking as you were bringing this up was that we do have a situation where somebody might want, if we think about the consumer of this data, we might have somebody who, whether it's they're targeting somebody whose data is mostly conservation or somebody who's targeting their data is mostly not conservation, they might want direct access to dimensions anyway without having to worry about going through an extra node. So I wonder if there's a way to connect backwards. I looked in the C document and I didn't think I saw this, but a way to link a measurement activity or a measurement event back to a dimension, if it makes any sense.
Yep. Yes. And
so that you would have the dimension, and then the dimension would have attached to it. This was measured at this particular time.
We did discuss last week, I believe, or last call about blank nodes, and dimensions definitely came up as one of those that would have a blank node, so no URI. So that kind of separate inferencing might not be possible if people embrace the blank nodes.
Yep. Yes. So in the model, there is the dimension, or P43 has dimension property, which then refers to dimensions which have values and units and so on. So they are real resources, and in this case, it does have a URI. So in theory, you could refer to it, but to look ahead to the partitioning discussion, anything that sort of is below the top level of the response. So the object itself clearly needs a URI because it's a real entity, whereas dimensions are typically just data structures, so hence probably wouldn't need URIs. So requiring dimensions to have URIs in the off chance that they are referred to by some external thing could be tricky, but we could go the other route. So if we had a human-made object and the dimensions are referred to by dimension, and then if there is information about the measurement activity, it would be assigned by the attribute assignment activity, which does the measuring. And then that activity would probably be an external resource because the same activity might measure multiple dimensions. And thus, yeah, it would need its own URI. So it could go from the dimension to the activity rather than from the activity to the dimension. That might be one solution.
Okay, I think that's what I'm suggesting.
Just to pipe in, that's often a convenient way of doing things, also for things like appellation, or which you don't, if you can hear me, I don't know.
Yep, hi George.
So I have a bad connection. Hi. Yeah, so if you have something that has a binary relation, typically like is identified by, but it comes in sometimes that they have attributions, then it's very nice to first go through the binary relation and then continue that path over to the attribute assignment, rather than just running through the attribute assignment, because then you lose the consistent way of checking for the appellation if you don't know about or don't care about the event. So that's just me saying +1.
Yep. And then again, not to have the partitioning discussion before the partitioning discussion, but it seems entirely relevant here. Whether or not the measurement activity includes the information about the dimension or not would be something that we would also want to discuss. So if so the measurement would measure the, object and assign it the dimension. So it seems like it would just be, it would have two different nodes, both of which were in the same resource, e.g. the object itself, in this case object 44, and the dimension, in this case value 6, would both be in otherwise the same response. So it's not that you wouldn't be able to find the dimension, but it might be strange if the measurement is a separate response, that it doesn't include the dimension that it measured. So perhaps this will be easier to discuss in broader terms in the partitioning, or do you want to talk about it now?
So I guess the first thing to say is I agree with Rob's characterization a little while back about putting community above rigid adherence to principles. I think that's very sensible in this case. Possibly related to partitioning, I guess my question is, from an implementation point of view and particularly a validation point of view, is having those two routes something that implementers are comfortable with? As far as I can see, there's no reason why they shouldn't be, but that seems like an important question in terms of supporting the profile or profiles.
Yes. Yeah. Well, from our perspective, so taking my chair hat off, from a Getty perspective, using arches as an implementation, we would not be able to refer to the dimension itself from outside of the object. So even though in this example it has a fully qualified URI, arches doesn't manage, or would not allow that URI to be referred to by another instance. So I was happy to hear George say that it was a reasonable pattern to go from the dimension out rather than from the measurement in, because we certainly could not implement, in arches at least, a pointer from outside of this particular document into the dimension. Yeah, and it sort of parallels the blank node discussion, that if it's a blank node, you can only refer to it within the same document.
Right. So that means it's all good as long as there isn't a counter implementation, essentially, that can't do it the other way.
Yeah. David, is this something that you've encountered at the NGA? I know that you've done quite some implementation work.
Yeah. And we haven't looked too much into the conservation data. I mean, a lot of our measurements tend to fall into, fairly general categories. So, and I'd say that I think it would be, we have other challenges I think we have to solve first with just the normalization of the data to get to a point of, looking at the vocabularies associated with the different dimensions that are actually being measured.
Any other thoughts or comments about the implementation question? Well, shall we try to put the assigned by property onto dimensions and have it refer to the measuring event? Optional, of course, if you have it. it seems a little bit also like the color discussion, where the abstract type sort of lives somehow below the more specific dimension for the color. That would be, we are going from the specific dimension to the activity that generated it, and potentially other dimensions. And then if we run into implementation challenges, we of course can come back and revisit the decision. As with absolutely anything, nothing is set in stone. So that seems reasonable to, well, at least to Kevin and Bree so far. Everyone else is okay with that as a solution for this issue?
Mm-hmm.
Great. All right, thank you everyone. So go on to partitioning, which we've already started to talk about. So last call and a little bit of the call before, we sort of walked through some of the principles of how to split up the graph into little chunks. And I believe got to here. So I think the sort of, to take these principles and then apply them to what we have, there will be some structures that will never be split out. They'll always be part of a response. I think those are name and identifier, because they are always specific to the thing that they name or identify. And they're mostly just data structures. They're not real world objects in the same way that a place or a person or a group or a collection or a painting or an object are. Types would always be embedded, such as the type of type pattern that we've been talking about. But the actual description of the type would almost certainly be external. We're not going to embed all of the dozens of names for painting from AAT into every single painting. But the reference to the type and the internal patterns, such as type of type, would be. Then all of the beginning of existence and end of existence events and activities would be embedded within the thing which they are the beginning or end of existence of. So the production of an object is included in the object's record, object's document, and the destruction of the object is also equally included in it. The reason for this is from the one-to-one-ness of it, at least in the linked art profile. So in CRM, generally a production can produce 26 different objects, at which point it has to be its own separate thing. But we would have a separate production for each of them, which would then be part of a larger activity, which was the production of 26 objects. Meaning that production can always be part of the object. Similarly, destruction can always be part of the object because it is the destruction only of that object. So the fire in Brazil that destroyed hundreds of thousands of objects isn't a destruction that destroyed things, it's a fire that caused hundreds of thousands of destruction events. And statements, so this is the pattern that we use a lot. That statement is really just a data structure which assigns some string and information about it to the resource, and hence has no life beyond the resource, so it can be embedded. Similarly, the sort of dimension and time data structures of dimension, monetary amount, and time span. What are your questions and thoughts about that set?
This is just ad lib, but for if the production event happened to be the production event of a person,
the birth,
i.e. the birth, then it's the categorical, I mean, it's the, it's a typical example of the meeting in time in an event of two beings, being the mother and the child. So would that be problematic in terms of having it? I'm just looking at an edge case. I mean, I don't really have a stake, but well, you see what I mean? Like, wouldn't you need to attach, obviously, both of them to the same birth event.
But that's, yeah, it
is
seems
that a
like
problem that it's embedded?
Yeah.
No.
I don't think so. It just enforces a directionality from the birth to the mother. So from the child to the birth, from the birth to the mother, in the same way that it's from the painting to the production and from the production to the artist.
Yeah. Okay.
If the mother died in childbirth and thus it was the death of the mother and the birth of the child, then we might have a stickier problem.
Yeah, well, we wouldn't model it that way anyhow. We had the
think
discussion about everybody's death is their own death and couldn't share it. So,
and it would be a causal relationship potentially rather than a identity relationship.
Yeah.
So we're what other thoughts on these ones, if any?
Sounds good so far.
Okay. So then the type set, so types, materials, measurement units, languages, and currencies don't have their own responses. So because we're going to bring them in from external vocabularies. So it's not up to us to document or enforce how AAT provides the description of painting this, or how I forget the name, but the very good language authority describes languages. So we can reference them, but we don't need to worry about what they look like.
So that kind of underscores the notion of underscore label as just being a developer or a hint as opposed to an actual data point.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because that label could not appear at all in the response, or maybe it does appear today, but then the language vocabulary takes it out and replaces it with a slightly better one or a slightly different one. Or AAT changes from watercolors to watercolor, and keeping them in sync seems impractical and unproductive. Okay, so then, given our discussion in Oxford about provenance, it seems like we have this provenance activity that would include acquisitions and payments and moves and transfers of custodies and so on. So that would be a probably necessary top level response. Thus, the set of boundary classes would be person, because people participate in lots of things and are first class entities in almost every system. Group, because groups can take actions and they consist of people, so they can't be in any one thing, any one other resource. Human made object, of course. Visual item, so the rationale for this one is that the same abstract image can be carried by multiple physical and digital resources, and hence can't be embedded within any single physical or digital thing. Oh, and Toby, thank you for bringing it up. By boundary class, I just meant that when we have the graph of all of the information, the classes that would form the boundaries between responses at the API level would be these ones. So whenever you hit a human-made object, as you were walking your graph, you would say, okay, I need to start a new response. Or the things, or to put it a different way, the resources that must have URIs that when you dereference them, you get back the description are these things. Then place, because place can be referred to by lots of other different activities. Period, we haven't really talked about periods, so it might even just not be necessary. But period is useful for saying this came from the Ming Dynasty time, or this came from the Jurassic period, or this is a modern or Renaissance thing. And then having at least the local definition of what Renaissance is, or Dark Ages. Linguistic object, so this is not the embedded statements, but the equivalent of visual item. So if you have a text of a work, such as a journal article or a book or a letter or whatever, then that could equally be carried by multiple physical or digital objects, and hence, much like visual item, needs to be separate. Phase, well, we haven't found a need for phase yet, so let's get rid of that one. Set, so this is the collection class, which can then contain, have members, which are many different things, so it needs to be its own thing. And then events and activities, well, activity for provenance certainly, and events we need to talk about in more detail. So at least from my assessment, those are the primary resource types that sort of interact or interrelate. And are there any suggestions first about ones that we would want to take out because they really could be embedded within one of the others? Oh, I guess I've missed one, which is digital object. Digital object, so the same as human-made physical object, a digital object can carry a visual item, it can carry a linguistic object, it's created by people and so on, just happens to be digital rather than physical. I just learned this today. I'm at a conference in Eastern time zone, so it's not 8 AM for me today. What are your thoughts on this? Which implies that you have thoughts, not questioning whether you have thoughts. No.
Well, okay, so I guess the boundary classes would have, so if you have a, like you were saying, a linguistic object that has lots of associations with, say, a physical object, is that, the boundary classes are represented in their entirety with all of those relationships in a separate request? Is that, yes. Am I reading that right? Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that statements are specific to that particular entity.
Yep.
And therefore they are embedded.
Exactly. Yeah. So
okay.
a person in the response for person, for any given person, there would be the person's name, the person's identifier, types for the person, including the types of types, their birth, their death, the statements about them, any dimensions that they had, I guess height and weight, not that anyone, I guess, records them in our systems. I don't think people can have monetary amounts or time spans directly, or materials, or languages, or currencies. So then the rest of those would be the embedded data, and then there would be references to external resources, such as the groups that the person was a member of. I don't imagine there would be direct references to objects, or places, or periods. Maybe sets, certainly events and activities. Digital object, I guess, for representation, e.g. this person is depicted in this image. And the same with all of these other ones. Yeah, but they would all have these things and refer to the other ones.
So where does production go?
So production, because it's the beginning of existence of an object, would be embedded within the human-made object response.
So how is the relationship between the person and the human-made object made in the person response?
And yeah, this is, I guess, one of the implications of the patterns. So at the moment, it probably wouldn't be. So I think it would be the human-made object is produced by the production I was right, sorry. It is produced by, which is carried out by URI of person, which is of type who is of type person. So in order to find out who produced the object, you would ask the object rather than the person.
Right, but in the person response, how is the object associated?
Yep, it wouldn't be, I think, is the implication from.
Okay. But it might need, yeah, this is why we're talking about this, yep.
From these ones that we don't want to repeat, we don't want to duplicate information because then it gets out of sync potentially. And the inverse relation, it's an inverse relationship here. So yeah, how to how to get from the person back to the objects that they created is, I think, part of that inverses question. But in this case, it's doubly interesting because the person carried out the production, but the production doesn't have its own URI. Oh, I should really put the URI. This one. Or doesn't necessarily have its own URI because it's embedded within the higher level object. Meaning you would want to have some sort of triple store probably implementation. Well, not necessarily. You would want to have an implementation that could reverse that all the way back from person to human-made object, rather than relying on the data that's sort of explicitly recorded. But yeah, this could equally be one of the exceptions, that everyone wants to know what the objects are that the person creates, and hence, it's one of the things that we bake into the API as being an important consideration, even though it is an exception to the don't duplicate information principle.
So is there not a difference so even though you're not representing the all views of the graph because you don't want to duplicate information, the API should probably be able to traverse the graph even if that portion is not expressed in the efficient representation.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and I think that the question that this brings up is there are there separate levels of implementation for the API? If where the backwards traversal of things, which is very useful, is done at a different layer compared to just the vanilla description, which would use this particular pattern.
Right.
What are your other thoughts on the set? Or maybe I can go through these briefly. So then to expand out this list, it would be physical objects, people, groups, places, collections, provenance activity, which then would embed things like acquisition, promises, moves, payments, etc. Visual work, textual work, digital object, and maybe digital service, which we haven't talked about, but that might equally go into digital object. So those would be from the above list, which is here. Those would be our sort of core API responses that we could then write validations for to say, does this meet the expected pattern for a physical object or a group or a set? Okay, so further thoughts? Again, we can try this and see where we run into difficulties, as we can, some of which we can probably predict, e.g. what objects did this person make, and some of which we will only find out by trying it.
Yeah, I think it's going to probably require an implementation experiment to flesh these out. I guess the question is what would we, or what would the next step be once this document or sets of documents are created to represent an entire collection? Is there an immediate next step that kind of furthers, aside from just verifying that we don't have any issues with producing this unique set of data points?
Yeah, I think the apart from documentation, which is always the next step, and I'm always behind on it, would be indeed to try to split up our data sets into these subsets, and then to, if not necessarily implement something that consumes it, but at least walk through the process of implement, the process that an implementation would do to use the data as it was coming back in that form, to look for pain points of when a consuming implementation would either not have something to be able to follow or not know how to do the thing that it wanted it to do, and then go back and try to resolve those questions either by repartitioning or by adding additional affordances, such as URI of the person / produced objects generates the list of objects that it produced, that the person produced. Here we can solve it in the level 0 data, or we can solve it at a higher level. Figure it out.
Yeah, I mean, we certainly need the level 0, so it makes sense to start there, I think. But I suspect, I mean, for organizations that have lots of statements, for example, that would otherwise be embedded in a person response, and they're not at all interested in those statements, it's a little inefficient to have to return them with a query when they're only, when in fact what they're interested in is a list of objects that were produced by that person.
Yep. Yeah, I forget whether I put it into the sort of design principles for this. I guess it is a slightly different question. For the directionality of the relationships between the responses, we have found it's more easier to hand generate or easier to manage in a UI, going from the member to the thing that it's a member of, or going from the part to the thing that it is part of, rather than saying this book has 1,000 pages, or this person was a prolific artist and produced 600 objects. Not that any one museum would probably have, well, photographs, I take that back. So yeah, if you have a photographer and you've got hundreds of Stieglitz photos, yeah, what are all of the photos at the NGA produced by Stieglitz? Yeah, having that in a response would also be quite a lot of data to produce, perhaps unnecessarily, if that wasn't what the client wanted. So
yep.
I did have some questions as to what to do with them. So at the provenance discussion in Oxford, we talked about auctions, and then as an event, the multi-day auction, and then the auction of the lot, which is part of the multi-day thing, which would then trigger the provenance activities that we have above. But it seems like these would also need to be separate responses, but they're very specific ones. That maybe there is just an event response type, such that we can put these things under it. Is that a reasonable approach, or do we need specifically, in the same way as we have physical object, would we need auction event and auction of lot as completely separately documented, different URI patterns, etc.? Any thoughts on that?
So why not just use event in general? Why also make it already so specific with the performance activity?
Sorry, Chris, there's a noisy air conditioning fan in this room, which was overpowering you.
So why not use more general event instead of what you're now using with the problems?
Yep. Yeah, I think that is a good answer. That up here there should be event as a class that would be used for auction of lot, the fire that destroyed, the paintings, or an earthquake, or an eruption, or ... And then that would be a single response type that would encapsulate all of these things, and they could of course refer to each other. So the auction of lot would be an event that refers to an auction event, which is an event. So the question really is, does anyone want to argue that these things deserve their own separate response type rather than being sort of rolled together into generic event?
I'd say keep it simple to start with.
Yeah, we can split it up later if needed. Okay, so we'll get rid of those in favor of event. And then the scope, some of the scope questions. So we just said that attribute assignment was useful, e.g. the measurement of the weight of the statue. Should that be part of the thing that has the dimension? Should it be part of the person who did it? Probably not, because they did lots of measurements. Or should it be its own separate activity? And I guess the same for non-beginning of existence, but things that modify either by adding or removing parts or just generic modification, that modify things. Are those part of the thing being modified, or are they their own separate activities?
For attribute assignment, considered it more generally, people might want to have arguments about them. And so I think that might make it that you want to be able to refer to it individually. I disagree with your attribute assignment, which you sourced and put your name on, and so on and so forth. For these reasons, would be my use case.
Mine for separates is for conservation. This is one of the critical things that is part of projects or part of experiments. It's one of the details, the amount of details that you want to have about a measurement or an observation would be at least as much as the thing being observed in many cases, which would imply that you wouldn't want it nested way down underneath a particular dimension data structure. There's also lots of them. You can observe pretty much any facet of an object. So having them referred to from that facet but described separately would reduce the size of the response of the object. And given that unless you're in the conservation space, you probably don't care about who gave it the identifier or said it was 17 feet wide. thus it reduces the size of the thing being assigned to its response, and enables the attribute assignment activity to be described in more detail for the community that does care about it. Oh, I see that it is the top of the hour. Are there any arguments against giving it its own?
Well, there's a lot of cases where you have the tombstone of the object displayed in some kind of application, for example, and dimensions are usually displayed there. So it could just be that the dimension statement is pulled for that, and that's the solution. But if it wasn't, it might be kind of a heavy lift to pull that out, or heavier, I should say.
Yep. That if all you know is one thing about the attribute assignment, such as the conservator or the curator who did the measurement, and then it would be much easier just to put that into the document rather than having a totally separate response.
Right. Yeah. And this might be where the API could help. If you requested the object and you said, and also give me these properties.
Yep. Oops, heavier data to separate rather than. Yep. Well, sorry, it is 5 past. So we shall continue this discussion next time. And yeah, Bree, I will copy your question into the docs that we do not forget it. But thank you to Richard for taking notes, and thank you to everyone for coming. And we'll continue this discussion and talk about whatever else is on the agenda in a couple of weeks' time.
Thanks, Rob.
Great, thanks everyone.
Thanks.
Cheers, Rob.
Thanks. Bye.